In with Chapter 3, Pharaoh and his subjects, from The Dwellers on the Nile, The Life History, Religion, and Literature of the Ancient Egyptians by E. A. Wallis Budge. And what one's the Dover edition. Okay, this is 1977 of the 1926, so not the cover. I mean, I'm not going to hold it on the cover. Pharaoh, king of all Egypt, was, as this title signifies, the great house. Pra, in which all his people lived and sought asylum, with far less reason than the Sultan of Turkey. With far less reason, the Sultan of Turkey called himself Bab al-Ali, or the Exalted Gate, which is commonly rendered Sublime Port. In prehistoric times, each district of Egypt had its own ruler, and the country was divided into a series of what were practically small kingdoms. In the late Neolithic period, there was one great king in Upper Egypt, and another in Lower Egypt, i.e. the Delta, and these two great divisions of the country were known throughout the later dynastic period as the two lands. Tahweh, and you find that designation in the Quran as well of the two lands. Tua, Tata, okay. Upper Egypt seems to have been divided into two parts, and the capital of the southern half was Hensu, which Hebrew writers, Isaiah 34, called Canes. And, okay, I don't remember whether you're talking about a chet or a calf, but the book called Isaiah. Isaiah didn't write Isaiah, and the Greeks knew as Heracleopolis. At the end of the Neolithic period, war broke out between the kings of Upper and Lower Egypt, and the king of the south conquered the king of the north, and so became the unifier of the two lands, and king of all Egypt. The conquest of Lower Egypt was probably not affected by one king, and it is not quite certain which king really earned the title of unifier of the two lands, though, on the whole, the credit of the subjugation of the north by the south must be given to Narmer, who was a mighty warrior and a great conqueror. Manetho, in his king list, makes Menes to be the first king of Egypt, and, as this name no doubt represents the Egyptian Mene, or Men, which was also one of the titles of Aha, the successor of Narmer, we may assume the final unification of Egypt was effected by him, or perhaps it unified at times and broke up at times, and the power of the king of Egypt at that time was absolute, well, thought to be at least, and the right of conquest made him the owner of the whole country, and the master of every living being in it, and the religious directors of the people were his servants. But sooner or later, every king of Egypt has found it expedient to be on good terms with the ancient priesthoods of the country, and the early dynastic kings obtained the support of the priesthood of Nekhen in Upper Egypt, and the priesthood of Per-Wetjet in the Delta. In the former city, the entity worshipped was Nekabet, the vulture entity, also known as Mut, right? And in the latter, the Uraeus entity, Wetjet. But the king was the lineal descendant of an entity who had reigned upon earth and was therefore considered as a god, even though he possessed a body of flesh, he was not only as the God of his people, but could present their offerings, together with his own, to himself. The king's will was as the God's will. His actions were the outcome of the God's thoughts. And looking upon the king's person, the people looked upon the God. He was worshipped as a God, the great God. Nachur, the beneficent God. Nachur, Nefer, and even as Lord, Maker of things. Nub, Yurixt. As a man, he built a temple to himself as a god, and he worshipped himself in it. For Amenhotep III built the temple at Sulb in his own honor, and worshipped himself in it, and he built another to his wife Ti as a goddess, and worshipped her as such in it. So we see in cultures like Göbekli Tepe and stuff, we started with the intercessory hero sort of thing, and made their way into not only these priests operating a phony theocracy, but an entity saying, "Oh well, I've incarnated it. I'm the God incarnate themselves." So, but it obviously would have taken time to convince people. You can't just show up, "I'm a God." People needed to be misled over the generations. The king claimed as his ancestor Her, or Horus, whose symbol was the hawk, which was in early times regarded as the personification of the spirit of the highest heaven, his right eye being the sun and his left eye the moon. His solar character is indicated by the disk on his head. As the son and descendant of Horus, the king adopted a Horus name, or title, which was written on a rectangular object, represented an open screen. Kind of looks like that. As the king approved by the ancient mother Demas, Nekabet, and Wetjet, he assumed a Nebti name or title. So you have a vulture and a snake sitting on the Neb symbol. And as the Horus of gold, and you have the bangle looking thing, he added a third name to his titulary as Lord of the Two Lands, or perhaps the unifier of Egypt, of Upper and Lower Egypt. He took at a later name a fourth title, the Nesubat name. Okay, this is like a Su. Sutbat, perhaps? And the double character read, Su is the symbol of his sovereignty over the south, and the bee, or hornet, is his rule over the north. The unity of the two lands is graphically depicted in the hieroglyph, which represents the lotus of the delta, and the papyrus of Upper Egypt twined round, the symbol of union, and we see it cut on the sides of the royal throne. But as a matter of fact, the separate existence of the south and the north was always recognized. As Lord of the South, the king wore the white crown, and as king of the north, the red crown, and each is clearly distinguishable. And the double crown, for some time, probably many centuries, the king was worshipped as the son of Horus, as a sun god. But during the rule of the great kings who built the pyramids of Giza, the priesthood of An, or Anu, the An of the Bible, Genesis 41-45, succeeded in gaining great power in the north, and their entity Ra, a form of the sun entity, attained a predominant position among the entities of Egypt. The city of An, or Heliopolis, the city of the sun, was founded in very early times, and it was large it was a large and important town, long before the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt by Narmer or Aha. It was the terminus of many caravan routes from the east, north, west, and south. It was the greatest center of trade and commerce in the north of Egypt, and we see Horus in human form, wearing the double crown, calling up the Nile during his conquest of Egypt. He has driven his harpoon into the hippopotamus, the symbol of revolt, rebellion, and evil, which is fettered by chains held by Horus, and by Isis, who kneels in the bows of the boat. So the male and female unseen beings are beings of choice, and the reference of them as gods means that they're trying to choose to be independent, and they've been attached to ideas of stuff that we can be or that we would connect to. So it does represent consciousness, but that doesn't mean there's not a spiritual reality connected to these things, whether a god or other entities that would react upon the same principles. Men of many nationalities and regions met and transacted business there, and as a result, the priesthood of On became a very wealthy and powerful body. By the way of On, foreign influences of all kinds came into Egypt, and the peculiar form of the worship of the sun entity, Yuf or Ra, that obtained there, I'm sure there's others, are there, seems to have been introduced from some country in the east, coming through Syria and Palestine. Oh, could it be the solar worship type of yoga? The priesthood of Ra watched their opportunity, and having succeeded in disposing of the last kings of the 4th dynasty, they were able to set on the throne in succession 3 of the sons of a woman called Rutet, the wife of a priest of Ra, of Sakabu. These children were declared to be sons of Ra, who in human form had companied with her. The same story is told about Queen Hatshepsut and Amenhotep III, who were held to have been begotten by Amun-Ra, according to the narrative of Pseudo-Callisthenes, Book 1, Chapter 8. Alexander the Great was the son of Amun, who took the form of Echtenebbus, the last king of Egypt, and begot him by Queen Olympias. The bas-reliefs illustrating the conception and birth of Amenhotep III are found in his temple at Luxor, and those that concern Queen Hatshepsut in her temple at Deir al-Bahari. The priest of Ra, having placed their nominees on the throne, determined to make an addition to the royal titulary, and a 5th name or title was added to it, describing the king as the son of Ra, Sa-Ra. For that time onwards, every king of Egypt called himself the son of Ra, and the Nubians, Persians, Ptolemies, and Romans who reigned over Egypt adopted it without scruple. In many cases, this name was the personal name of the king, or an abbreviation of it. And we have Seti I on the left, 1320 BCE, and Ramses II, king of Egypt, about 1300 BCE, on the right. Both 4th and 5th names of the king were written within ovals, the cartouche, and on many bas-reliefs, the oval is represented as being formed of a rope, of which the 2 ends are knotted together. This oval or cartouche, as it is commonly called, was intended to protect the king's name from evil influences, for to injure the king's name was to injure the king himself. The double knot was believed to be an amulet of great power. Now the Kushti thread, tied around, made of 72 threads, 3.5 sort of wraps around, or at least 3, right? But you want a little slack, so 3.5, and the sacred thread of the yogi disciple So this stuff goes way back, but you can also kind of trace some of it to the pre-Egyptian culture of Africa. Of the ceremonies that were performed in the earliest times, when a new king ascended the throne, we know nothing, but the news of his ascension was quickly promulgated. Under the new kingdom, 4 birds were released and sent, each into one of the quarters of the world, to inform all and sundry that a new king occupied the throne. The court scribes drew up his titulary, and dispatched copies of it throughout the country, and the king himself made a royal progress to all the ancient shrines, and assured the various priesthoods that he would respect their privileges and increase them. In the 1st or 2nd year of his reign, he set out to raid some country. In the earlier times, the countries were Sinai and the northern Sudan. In the latter, Palestine, Syria, and Mesopotamia, in order to show the nations around that he was a mighty warrior as well as a god. Well, it doesn't really show that, but in his own mind. That's part of where I got the phrase become a living demon from, is that, well, what is a demon? And, okay, someone who wants to take themselves as God, or others to proclaim that for them in a way. He fought in person, and custom of the country demanded that he should slay a number of prisoners with his own hand. Representatives of the vanquished peoples or tribes were made to kneel before him with their arms tied together at the elbows behind their backs, and the king smashed in their skulls with a stone-headed or metal-headed mace, or cut off their heads with a scimitar. Usually the king was the eldest son, with his predecessor by the king's woman, Suhumt, who was sometimes his sister, but many of the kings of Egypt were not of royal birth. In earlier times it was thought that when the king died, he departed to a heaven that was inhabited by the so-called gods alone. The sun god welcomed him, well, the sun entity, as his son and equal, and he reigned over these gods as aristocratically and as absolutely as he has reigned over men upon earth, and hunted at his will in the fields of the skies. He forced these entities to transfer their power and immortality to him, and he reigned in heaven forever and ever. And so that's one of the things that happens, is that the polytheism, the strengths, well, I mean, that which would lead someone to polytheism, once you've integrated these things without saying, oh, they have to be external deities, and you, or that you haven't given your power in these areas over to these entities, but there are spirits of places, angels of places, whatever, that's where perhaps the other, the idea that there's gods of this, that, and the other comes from. And the word God is very mistranslated. It's usually not quite in earlier times, the king lived with his queen and family in a mud brick house, like his subjects, and his household was very numerous. Though in theory he directed the affairs of the kingdom and attended personally to every detail of the administration of the laws, etc., and practiced the government of that country was in the hands of an official called Rotne, who was the equivalent of the wazir. Or is it Thati or Krate? It's the duck thing, but there is the duck that goes craw, craw. Yeah. But the wazir in modern Oriental courts, next to him in importance was the keeper of the seal, and we have the thingamajigger with the The seal itself was a small cylinder made of wood or stone, on which were cut the royal names and titles. It was perforated lengthwise and was carried on a string. So the string, so you can hold it. That's what the thing is. And it was worn on the person of the keeper of the seal. The cylinder was rolled over the soft sealing material used, perhaps mud, leaving on a copy of the inscriptions and hieroglyphs in high relief several wooden cylinder seals which were made and used in the late Neolithic period have been found, and it is doubtful if the use of the cylinder seal was introduced into Egypt from Lower Babylonia. As has been stated, the cylinder seal was superseded by a flat, rectangular stone seal, and later by a signet ring. The wazir and the keeper of the seal had a staff of scribes and other officials to assist them, and the overseers of the royal estates and cattle, and granaries, etc., were very numerous. Certain of the officials at court were kinsmen of the king and queen, and these both bore the honorific titles Suraks, Reknesu. Yeah, that's not right. You have Su and R and X. Suraks. But the king sometimes conferred this title on a friend. Well, perhaps there's variations of things, and why not show those characters? But the king sometimes conferred this title on a friend who was no relative at all. Another title was Slonks, Smur, Wat. Okay, we have Smur, Wat. Okay, yeah, that's right. I.e., friend and only friend. The king's personal attendants were very numerous, and among them may be mentioned the bearer of the royal stool or chair, the sandal bearer, the fan bearer, the men of the bodyguards, each of whom was responsible for the safety of the royal person, the keeper of his apparel, the steward of the place, and keeper of the king's private chambers, the butler, the baker, the treasurer, the captain of the royal barge, the keepers of the hunting and fishing equipment, the architect. The queen's household was also numerous, and included nurses and tutors for the princes and princesses, keepers of the apartments, keepers of the wardrobe, etc. One of the most valued honors that the king could bestow upon a meritorious official or friend was the gift of a tomb and permission to be buried near the royal tomb. As kings and rulers have done from time immemorial in many parts of Africa, the king of Egypt sent a funerary offering. When one of his officials or friends was buried, this offering was not only a proof of his regard for the deceased, but it indicated that he would extend his so-called divine protection to him in the other world. In other words, the deceased centered on the other world under royal auspices. When heaven was democratized and the king was believed to share it with the humblest of his subjects, it was generally assumed that he sent a funerary offering at the burial of every one of them, and the result of this was that on the tombs, sarcophagi, coffins, stela, etc., the signs Sudahatep were prefixed to every inscription, in which the deceased prays to these so-called gods and goddesses of the dead for meat and drink, for his ka, or personification of his spiritual individuality. People would call that the astral soul. The hieroglyphs mean the king, Su, gives, Da, an offering, Hatep. And we have this, and we have the pentagon on top thing, are perhaps, obviously the fire from a platform, are perhaps, well, I mean, it makes you think of that, are perhaps a table of offerings, and they are found on funerary monuments of the latest period. The great Babylonian king Hammurabi divided his Hatnurabi was actually what it's called in Persian, which Persian language, but Hatnurabi, divided his subjects into three classes, viz. The aristocracy or nobility, the class below, which probably included what we should call the middle and artisan classes, and the slave class. The Egyptian inscriptions make no mention of any such division of the population into classes, but three classes of beings are mentioned which may at one time have represented classes of the people. Henmemet, Bereket, and the Aperu, the first being gentry, the second intelligent, instructed class, and the third peasant laborers and slaves. So we have Henmemtu, okay, yeah. Ruxitu, okay. Apru. In Egypt, the hereditary landed proprietors formed a sort of feudal aristocracy, and their power was very great. Many of them held high offices under the king as priests and governors of nomes and heads of the departments of state. The nomarch was obliged to have an armed force under his command in order to keep order in his district, and had to equip and supply troops, both for land and river service. When the king ordered a raid to be made, such high officials sat as his chief judges in the law courts and drew up the enforced laws and assessed and collected the king's taxes. The nomarch was directly responsible for the king and well-being of the people in his nome, and his authority was well nigh absolute. Well, at least they're doing something for their collecting taxes. Egyptian history shows that the old feudal nobles in places like Nekab, Hierakonpolis, and Sun, Syene, or Aswan, were practically kings in their districts. It was through Menku, Seben, Harkuf, and other nobles of Sun, Syene, that the Egyptians of the 6th dynasty made their way into the Sudan and laid the foundation of their future conquest of that country. The nobles of Nekeb protected the southern frontier of Egypt for some centuries, and two of them, called Ahmes and Ahmespen Nekeb, contributed largely to the success of Egyptian arms in Western Asia under the 18th dynasty. Frequently, the interests of the great feudal lords and those of the king clashed, and the officials of the king found it very difficult to perform their duties. The power of the king began to diminish towards the close of the 6th dynasty, and that of the nobles increased steadily until Amen Mahat III, a king of the 12th dynasty, forced them to recognize his authority and obey his laws. But whenever any reason for central power was weak or lacking in the country, every lord proceeded to do what was right in his own eyes. Robbery and oppression became the order of the day, and the lower classes suffered greatly. And